Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's American Enterprise Institute webinar on marriage penalties, the marriage divide, and the U.S. safety net. My name is Matt Weidinger. I'm the Rowe Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI. Before joining AEI, I spent 28 years working on Capitol Hill, helping members of Congress improve safety net programs. Marriage penalties result from the intersection of two basic facts. First, our means-tested safety net reduces or eliminates benefits as household incomes rise. And second, if two low-income adults marry, their combined income rises. Add them together, and safety net programs often discourage especially working couples from marrying. That has important consequences for children, families, and entire communities, as Dr. Brad Wilcox will describe in a minute. Brad will review his new research brief, which he developed in collaboration with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which is titled The Marriage Divide, Marriage Penalties, and United States Welfare Policy. Brad is a visiting scholar here at AEI, as well as a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Virginia, where he directs the National Marriage Project. He is also the author of When Marriage Disappears, The Retreat from Marriage in Middle America. After Brad's opening remarks, he will moderate a panel discussion with Elaine Maag and Angela Rachidi, two distinguished scholars who've spent decades studying and developing proposals for improving safety net programs, including how they relate to marriage and family life. Elaine Maag is the Principal Research Associate in the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where she studies income support programs for low-income families and children. Elaine also coordinated the creation of the Net Income Change Calculator, a tool that allows users to understand the trade-offs between tax and transfer benefits and changes in earnings or marital status. Angela Rachidi is the Rowe Scholar in Poverty Studies here at AEI, where she studies the effects of safety net programs on low-income people in America. She's an expert in support programs for low-income families, and her research focuses on the effectiveness of government programs and policies on increasing employment and family well-being. Before joining AEI, Dr. Rachidi spent almost a decade researching benefit programs for low-income populations in New York City. By 12:40, we will open it up to questions. If you have a question, you can submit that by sending an email to Peyton Roth, that is at peyton.roth@aei.org. Again, peyton.roth@aei.org, or on Twitter using the hashtag marriage penalties. We'll wrap up by 1 o'clock. And also, Brad's report is available now on his scholar page here at AEI. Just search for Brad Wilcox in AEI, and it'll be 2 clicks away. And with that, let me turn the floor over to Brad to get us started. Brad, take it away.
Matt, thanks for introducing our time together today. And I'm also hoping that Peyton has the PowerPoint for us to see as well. Yeah, we can see that here on the screen now. And again, this is on a new brief being sponsored by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services called The Marriage Divide, Marriage Penalties, and U.S. Welfare Policy. Next slide, please. And as you were just informed, you can do questions to Peyton Roth at AEI. I also wanted to acknowledge the assistance of Jerry Regier and others at Public Strategies, of Peyton Roth at AEI, and to the staff of the Office of Family Assistance at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in giving me advice and counsel in writing this brief. And of course, also to acknowledge that the views I'm talking about today are not necessarily reflective of the official policy or the position of any agency of the U.S. government. So I want to begin today by mentioning that I got an email from a UVA graduate student at the beginning of this week who is from Arkansas. And in his email, among other things, he said, quote, "I continue to be amazed by the trajectory difference between my married versus unmarried friends. I keep thinking of my high school classmates who are basically trapped by Medicaid and other income-based programs never to get married." And so his email got me thinking about a couple of issues. Next slide, please. And of course, one thing that his email got me thinking about was the way in which we're now seeing a marriage divide emerging in our country, where not just poor, but many working class or middle class families are less likely to get married. They're more likely to have kids outside of marriage, as this slide here indicates. even as more educated, more affluent Americans continue to have their children in marriage as well. So, kind of one of the insights from his email was certainly apropos here. Next slide, please. And there was obviously an element of concern too in the email that I received from him as well. And I think that concern is warranted because we know that marriage matters for kids. We know that kids who are raised in stably married homes are more likely to be flourishing educationally, socially, and economically. We know that adults are more likely to be flourishing economically if they're stably married across the course of their adult lives. And we know that communities that have lots of stable two-parent families are also more likely to be doing well, and among other things, to be promoting economic mobility for poor children. So in a sense, the American dream is strongest in communities where stable marriage anchors family life in those communities. So this marriage divide that we've seen sort of, growing up in the US in recent years obviously puts some kids, some adults, and some communities at a real disadvantage, on a number of different fronts. But his email also suggested maybe there's some way in which the rise of the welfare state may be implicated in this marriage divide. And we certainly can see from this slide, for instance, that the size and scope of federal power and authority when it comes to social welfare has definitely increased in recent decades. And what this means practically is that a growing share, as the next slide here indicates, of American families are receiving some kind of means-tested benefit or also receiving an earned income tax credit, for instance. So what that means practically is that today, more than 40% of families are receiving a benefit like Medicaid or a child care subsidy or food stamps. And so what's sort of happening in terms of, public policy is on the radar screen for many families. It's sort of entering into sort of how they think about supporting and sustaining their families. And in particular, as the next slide indicates to us, what we're seeing today is that, many families, face a penalty when a couple with kids, marry. In this case, I've got a slide here that's derived from a report that I did with Angela and another colleague. And what you can see here is that for families with kids 2 and under, they're more likely to experience a penalty when their income is in the second or third quintile. So that's basically showing us here that working class, lower middle class families are more likely to face a penalty for marrying compared to, cohabiting, for instance, particularly if they're not reporting that they're cohabiting when it comes to, getting a particular benefit of one sort or another. And of course, this point has also been found in work done by Elaine at the Urban Institute and work done by Eric Randolph as well, looking at marriage penalties. We've been seeing this finding play out across a number of different studies. Next slide as well, please. As well as work done by Doug Besheroff and Neil Gilbert. And they actually, coming back to Arkansas here just for a second, they found that marriage penalties were often quite high in Arkansas. And in the case of sort of one potential couple with kids, they would be as much as 32% of their total household income. Now, it's important to acknowledge this is at the higher end of any kind of penalty, but it just sort of underlines the way in which penalties often face couples with kids in the US, particularly working class couples with incomes, between about $25,000 and $55,000 a year. Next slide, please. Now, I think probably one question that's certainly running through the mind of some of the people here who are on this webinar listening in is, well, there may be these penalties, but are they really kind of important in terms of shaping behavior? Do they matter, really, is the question. And on that score, I think the studies suggest that they matter for some programs, but maybe not other programs. And so let's just go quickly through some of the research on Medicaid, the EITC, and TANF. So when it comes to Medicaid, work that I'm doing with 2 economists suggests that Couples with young kids face a penalty, who face a penalty are less likely to marry. And work done by other public policy scholars indicates the expansion of Medicaid was linked to an increase in unmarried childbearing for higher parity births, for second and third births, for instance. So again, there's some evidence that Medicaid may be an issue here when it comes to marriage penalties in America. And then we also see some research indicating too that the earned income tax credit in some cases is linked to a decreased likelihood of marrying, an increased likelihood of cohabiting, and just more generally to lower marriage rates as well. So the ITC also seems to be kind of an issue for some couples, particularly couples where both of them are earning a lower income. And that's something we see in the ITC. Next slide, please. But for TANF, both work that I've done and work that I've done with other colleagues, including Angela, suggests that TANF is not having an impact. I mean, the penalties that we associate with TANF are not particularly consequential for family formation in terms of marriage. Although it's, of course, also, I think, important to note here that TANF is a much less important player in the kind of broader constellation of social welfare policies in America today than it was, a while back, compared, of course, to AFDC as well. Next slide, please. And then when you kind of look beyond just particular programs and kind of ask the American public about their perception, what you see is that a minority of Americans report that, in this case, someone that they know has been affected by these kinds of penalties when it comes to their own decision to marry. So in this case, 31% of Americans report that they know someone who has chosen not to get married in connection with some kind of marriage penalty in the US. And then the final point in terms of kind of how this may be consequential is that it looks like penalties seem to matter most for working and lower middle class families. We've seen this in Medicaid, for instance, and also for couples where both partners are earning close to $20,000. So again, this sort of suggests that sort of this lower middle class, bracket is most affected by the penalties that families can face here in America today. So, kind of pulling back here from my perspective, as we kind of think about, the retreat from marriage in America and the way in which we're seeing this marriage divide emerge, where more educated, more affluent Americans continue to marry in large numbers, continue to stay married, and continue to have their kids in marriage. And where many, not just poor, but now working class Americans are often not having their kids in marriage and they are not getting married. I think one factor playing out in all of this is the way in which our public policies tend to penalize marriage for families, particularly for working class families, as I've talked about. And I don't want to minimize the importance of shifts in the economy, nor shifts in the culture in all of this. But what I do want to suggest today is that I think that the marriage penalty is one piece in the broader puzzle that we are assembling and trying to understand why it is that our country has become so divided in terms of our family life when it comes to marriage. So what are some policy solutions that might be helpful and might be effective, might address this marriage penalty? Well, one strategy I think would be to double the threshold for means-tested programs and policies, like Medicaid, for instance, and to both kind of focus our attention on the families who are, I think, most in need here in terms of timing of marriage and formation. I would focus on families with kids under the age of 5. And that would also, of course, minimize the cost associated with addressing this penalty in that way. A second idea, too, is to think about, as we kind of, bring new policies to bear in support of American families, to move more towards universal policies and away from means-tested policies. So, for instance, instead of doing a child care subsidy targeted at lower income families, we can think about a child allowance that would be made available to either all American families or to a very broad set of families. And then so, taking this particular path, we would minimize the chance that families would be penalized for getting married. And the third point that I would make too, is we kind of think about addressing this, reforming our public policies in ways to eliminate or minimize the marriage penalty, we kind of communicate to the broader public that, policy X does not penalize you for getting married, so that we can kind of change the expectation, people's ways of thinking, so that they don't worry about the impact of getting married for their financial well-being as a family. So to kind of wrap up my summary of the brief and my perspective here, I want to just underline the way in which I think it's important for us to sort of realize that in recent decades we have worked at the policy level to eliminate or to minimize many of the marriage penalties facing upper income Americans in the tax code. And so we've kind of addressed a lot of these issues for more affluent Americans. Of course, I think the tragic irony here, right, is that marriage has really eroded the most, is weakest to most among lower income Americans, including working class Americans, as we've seen today. And so kind of from a justice perspective, I think it's a time to eliminate the marriage penalty facing lower income families, penalties that are now falling hardest upon working class Americans. And the hope here, right, is that we'd like to move towards a world where the kinds of concerns articulated by this UVA student that I heard from this week, where he sees, some of his peers kind of being trapped out of marriage because of our public policies, would no longer be, a concern that we'd be expressing in connection with American public policies and with American families. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to my colleague Angela to give her perspective, and then Elaine after that to give her perspective, both on my comments and also on this issue more generally. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Brad, for that. It is always very interesting and eye-opening when you speak about some of the data and the statistics behind marriage. And it's great to be here with you and Elaine and Matt to talk through this issue. So I know that people have obviously a lot of opinions about marriage across the board, right? And I think though, people generally agree and believe that marriage is particularly beneficial when children are involved. For the most part, the research bears that out. And I think we can all mostly agree that that's true. So then we start thinking about government programs and how it interacts with marriage. And that's why that is such a critical question and issue to be looking at. We, for the most part, also want government programs to help people. That's what most of our government programs are designed to do. But the problem comes in when those government programs change behavior in ways that actually might harm people, even though they're well-intentioned and are setting out to help them. So we obviously see that in marriage, as Brad talked about. We also see that quite a bit with work. And so many of our programs disincentivize work, and then we also know that they disincentivize marriage. So we're kind of faced with two competing and not ideal scenarios. One is you don't have government programs at all because they're changing behavior in these undesirable ways, which is obviously not a good solution. Or you set up these programs in a way that do change behavior in undesirable ways, and then you just have to keep layering on more and more government assistance to counteract those negative effects. So as policy scholars, as all of us are, and policymakers, it is a very difficult issue and question to kind of grapple with. So I just wanted to touch on what this does look like in reality, because I think it is important to think through how people actually experience these programs and how they're set up. As Brad talked about, we know quite a bit about what these programs might do to couples. So we can look at data and analyze data and describe how many or what types of families are hurt by these policies if they were to get married. We generally know, as Brad described, that families where you have two parents where they are both working, they generally face a penalty because their income when they're married becomes too high to make them eligible for programs. But it actually benefits families where only one of the parents works and the other person does not work. And I did a study in 2015 that was looking at a cohort of unmarried parents who had a new baby. This was a Fragile Families data, and looked at, well, what would happen to those families with a new baby if they got married in relation to the EITC. And it was just about half actually faced a penalty. And about 20% actually would have been better off if they got married, and the rest, it didn't matter at all. So it's some benefited and some didn't, and obviously creates some issues in trying to devise the best policy for those families. The next, so we clearly know that this exists and that some families are harmed. The other major question is, or potentially would be harmed, is to Brad's point about how does it actually affect people's behavior though? And Brad mentioned some of the research, but I just wanted to emphasize how difficult of an empirical question this is actually to answer. Ideally, we would randomly assign people to a group where they got married, and equally, or people who looked exactly like them were assigned to a group that didn't get married, and we'd compare the two. Obviously not at all possible, unable to do that in the research community. And so I think we have to think really hard about what are some rigorous ways that we can test these policies, that we can get better answers. And I think one way that we could potentially do that is to think about this kind of from another perspective, which is, what if we had government programs that actually were more generous for married families? And can we randomly assign families to those kind of programs and see if that has any effect on marriage? So that's one potential idea, at least, for moving forward in terms of a research agenda. And I'll just then end with kind of my thoughts on the policy implications of this and what we could do from a policy perspective, because as I laid out at the beginning, not having any programs is not an option, and kind of leaving things the way they are is also not an option. So Brad laid out a few of them. I think trying to make programs equally generous for married families as they are for unmarried families is likely the best solution. But I just have some concerns about that, because once you make it more generous for married families, you start to introduce some work disincentives, especially programs that are not tied to work, like SNAP. I think it's maybe less of an issue for programs, but it still exists for programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit and even child care assistance, because those are only for working people, but you still have this work disincentive. And some people might say, well, that work disincentive doesn't matter. There's children in the home. One parent can then stay home with the child. But in the long run, for people who would prefer working and because of government programs choose not to, it likely does not benefit them in the long run. So I would argue, I think we need to take a stronger look at how the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit interact. I do have concerns about proposals around just a child allowance, but I think that we can see how you can maybe make the EITC more generous for low-income families, because once families get married, they then become eligible for the child tax credit, at least a more generous child tax credit, because their income would be a little bit higher. So I think we need to better understand how those two programs interact and might affect marriage decisions. So I'll end there. I'm curious Elaine's thoughts, and I look forward to having more of a discussion.
Yeah, this is one of those really funny topics where, and I think Brad's literature review does such a good job. People are really concerned about it across all political viewpoints. It's not like there's people out there saying, I wish children were doing worse, or I wish people were divorcing at higher rates. So, these things are fine. So it's this sort of understanding, like, what is government doing, and is it encouraging or discouraging behaviors that we think would be helpful? So as Angela pointed out, marriage is really complicated, right? We know it's not based on purely economic incentives. And the evidence suggests from Brad's report that even when economics are involved, it's not like tilting the tables so much, these transfer programs. If we really wanted to sort of encourage marriage and remove all these disincentives, and also not grow sort of what Brad terms, that welfare state, we would have this really giant program just supporting work, and we would get people off all these programs because they would be working. So, but that would be extraordinarily expensive and difficult, and it's easier to think about changing these small programs. So given that children do tend to do better in households with married parents, even if the government isn't discouraging a lot of marriage, it seems like it shouldn't be treating cohabiting couples more favorably than married couples. So we could look for instances of that and try to figure out how to solve it. The discussions that led up to this report took place, I think, over about a year ago, and they were really fascinating. And one thing I like about the report is that it sort of incorporates all these issues that people are dealing with. And then it takes this marvelous step of going through programs step by step. So what I thought I'd do in my comments is sort of think about what I think the next stage of research is, sort of thinking about the salience of various penalties. Does it differ across programs? I think we need to think about program design versus how people are behaving in the programs, because the government has a lot more control over rules implementation than it does over programs that are largely, voluntary compliance is what we rely on. And then I wanted to spend a little bit talking about reform proposals directed at the EITC, since that's where I do more of my work than in the transfer program. So the next stage of research is something that, I'm glad that HHS is concerned about and thinking about. So I would sort of argue on the vein of what Angela is saying, thinking about the EITC and CTC together, but we ought to try to think about how all these programs come together to affect people as they move from programs that maybe are more harsh on marriage to programs that could be made, less harsh. And I did want to plug that, the Urban Institute has the transfer income model where we can add up like who's getting what and what happens if they marry. And we could also think about, the net income change calculate, which programs are really the big. Also think the research needs to go a little deeper on, do these programs affect people of different races and education and income level differently, so that we ought to be thinking about some sort of community-based solutions. So and then the other piece that I think we should add to the research is, do the benefits of marriage vary by income level? So is it possible that marriage penalties are really germane to low income families, but once you hit some sort of income threshold, it doesn't really matter the marriage penalty for kids, because you have enough income in your single parent household that the kid's going to be fine. And that might drive us to focus on, should we continue down this path of eliminating marriage penalties for high income people, or should we really just drive all that money down to eliminating marriage penalties for low and moderate income penalties? So the second piece is understanding the salience of various penalties. And I think Brad pointed out that, TANF is a very small program. It just does not affect a lot of people right now. And so probably putting a lot of effort in that might not be important in the overall picture, but I bet for TANF families, those penalties are extremely visible. So it's just crystal clear, when I marry and bring someone into my household, my benefits will change. Whereas tax programs are much more difficult to sort out. We don't resolve them on a month by month basis. We resolve them at the end of the year. And so even though there's research showing the EITC and child tax credit are affecting marriage somewhat, it's, I think, pretty believable that people have a harder time figuring this out, maybe at the time of marriage, and it's sort of something you figure out ex post. So I'm not sure how much it's affecting marriage. And that uncertainty, is something we ought to take into account when we're studying this. So, the same thing goes for childcare benefits. I bring in a person to my household and it's crystal clear I'm going to lose that childcare benefit. Whereas, these other child tax credit and whatever might be later on. So the third thing, this program design versus behavior, and this is where I think some interesting work was done. So my colleague Greg Otch and I did this work that Brad cites where we show there's actually a lot of bonuses at the low end. And in part it's because programs like SNAP are designed to take your whole household into account. So it doesn't really care if you're married or cohabitating. But then Doug Bezheroff used the same tool that we use to say this. And he came to the exact opposite conclusion. And he said, what matters is that when you go to apply for SNAP benefits, there is an incentive for you to not report your whole household. You should just report yourself and your children. And then he finds these huge penalties. Well, that's a penalty that's borne by this compliance behavior, and it's not in the program rules. And so I think policymakers just have to think differently about those two issues. And then finally, the implications for reform. The one that I think is talked about most often is just, double the EITC for married couples or push the phase out very far. The problem is that will reduce the marriage penalty, but that will also cause you to deliver a substantial amount of benefits to the people who are arguably least needy. And so we have to decide, is that value of marriage more important in the long term, or is it better to try to push as many dollars to the most vulnerable people, who I would argue are often single parents, in the moment? And you have to decide, which is more important to you. And then if you go to my preferred solution, which is to base all these work credits just on your own work, you get these really great work incentives, right? I'm never discouraged to work until I hit the phase out. I'm always encouraged to take on more work. But when we looked at these a while ago, if I do that, about a quarter of all the benefits from these worker credits are going to go to families with relatively high incomes, because there's one high earner in the couple and one low earner in the couple. And again, you might decide that's totally fine, because either we're going to pay for these programs with money from high income people, so it'll sort of be a wash in the end, or that value of marriage is so important in that work incentive that we're willing to just provide subsidies for relatively high income people rather than keeping them on low and moderate income people's. So those are sort of my thoughts. In the end, I think it's an issue that we need to be concerned about. I think when we design programs, we have to be careful, but I also think it's really hard to design a program with no marriage penalties. And that's just because people do have extraordinarily diverse characteristics, and you're always going to have a very low income person marry a very high income person. And that is a marriage penalty that's just very hard to solve for.
Thank you, Elaine. Let me just quickly, we've gotten some questions. I'm going to mention that at the state level, we've seen work in Minnesota trying to address the marriage penalty with a kind of grandfathering one of their programs, so that people who are getting married don't lose a particular benefit. I think it's the first year. So that's one other kind of innovative sort of state level policy we've seen. And there's been some movement with the Georgia Center for Opportunity to try to think about ways to address this issue from the state level in Georgia. And I think there are other kind of efforts afoot in different states, but those are just two examples. Let me go back to Angela, and then I'm going to go to Elaine after that. But it would sort of be geared towards married families. It might kind of, if you kind of netted things out, might, rectify some of these penalties. What do you have in mind in particular on that front as an example, perhaps?
You could set up, just for example, use the EITC or even the child tax credit, but make it more generous for married families, and see if that actually incentivizes marriage, but actually just makes it, I would argue, might make it easier for unmarried people who wanted to get married anyway, just kind of makes that decision a little bit easier. But just thinking about these programs from the perspective, and it does, like to Elaine's point, it changes the focus a little bit. It kind of makes marriage more important than providing benefits to the lowest income families a little bit. And is that something that policymakers would want to do? I would argue it might be interesting to test that on a small scale to see what kind of a difference that actually does make. But yeah, that's kind of what I would envision.
Okay. And then Elaine, a question that I had for you is, it seems to me like if I have to sort of think about the programs that might be most consequential in terms of shaping here, it's ones that sort of affect people day in and day out. Things like Medicaid, for instance, or childcare subsidies, whereas again, like the EITC or the CTC are things that happen once a year and might not be as salient, but kind of day in and day out, you can kind of see, and I talked to a couple in here in Virginia, they've been together for a while. They've got two beautiful little girls. And I asked them kind of at a certain point, why aren't you married? They said, well, we sat down and we kind of did the calculus and we figured out that we would lose access to Medicaid for the mom and the two kids. And so that was, obviously a very salient thing for them. So is it your sense that it's some of these programs that are kind of in people's lives on a regular basis that are more consequential? And as we kind of think about ways to address this, we might be looking at focusing first on those programs. What's sort of your take on that?
Yeah,
issue?
so that's definitely my thinking is if you're trying to affect behavior, you need to find the things that people are reacting most to. And I should also say that program in Minnesota, I think it's incredibly innovative. And I'm, excited to see those results. And right, you could do that in lots of programs, right? Look back at last year's benefit, calculate this year's benefit, take the bigger one to sort of give you that 1 year buffer on all these changes that are happening. But yeah, in general, Medicaid's huge, right? It's a problem if you lose your health insurance and the only thing that changed was I got married. Like it's going to be a problem.
And we also have a question coming in too, Elaine, for you, and that is, does the Urban Institute's marriage calculator still exist online? And if so, where can people find it?
So the marriage calculator involved into the net income change calculator. And although when you enter data in the NIC, what it's asking you to do is change wages or hours, you can just run two simulations. So the first time, run a single person, and the second time, choose a married couple. So you can still do the work. It's just 2 steps now instead of 1. And then the Tax Policy Center, if you're only interested in the tax side of it, you can do the same thing. We usually around Valentine's Day, we update our marriage calculator. And there you can see, sort of what Brad was saying, like we eliminated a lot of penalties for sort of this middle income married couple through rates, but we kept a lot of hidden ones in there, which you can see some of them in that calculator, but it's on Urban's website.
I want to see too if Matt wanted to come back into our conversation as well. He just, came to AI from the Hill, where he had lots of experiences working on welfare policy. So Matt, I don't know if you want to jump in here and say anything in connection with this conversation that we've just had. See if we can get
sure. Yeah, the one thing I would say on this, and like Brad suggested, I'm still sort of suffering from the slings and arrows of a long career on Capitol Hill. And Elaine kind of made reference to this. It's important to have these discussions sort of in general, the importance of marriage, how programs affect individuals' marriage. We elect a group of people every year who have to wrestle with these questions. And outside of the pandemic, they also have to wrestle with, well, how do we pay for the policy changes that we want to make? And these changes are not inconsequential. A large part of what drives this is, so the difference between the incentive effect and what exists naturally, right? These policies exist because of limited resources. So programs were designed to say people in a certain income range will receive a benefit, and that would phase out as income went up, because we wanted to say we want to focus benefits on people at sort of lower income ranges. Now, if you talk about doubling those income ranges, where phase outs, say today they phase out benefits between $20,000 and $40,000 for a single parent. Now you're phasing out between $40,000 and $80,000 for married couples. You're moving from benefits that are focused on the lower couple of income quintiles, or especially the lowest income quintile, to now the broad middle class is receiving access to benefits. And it's more than just what behavior are we incenting, it's expanding benefits for a group of people that already exist in those categories. So there are going to be some people who are already married who will be made newly eligible for benefits if you do things like double income thresholds. So that's an important part of the conversation, and something just to bear in mind when we talk sort of generally about, well, wouldn't it be great if we did this? Somebody is going to have to come up with some way to either squeeze spending or raise taxes somehow over some period of time to pay for that. And that has to be balanced against, the general point that we're trying to make, which is an incredibly important one, which is marriage is critical. It's critical for children's futures. But that also has to be thrown into the mix of the sort of broader policy discussion of how do we make this all work out in the end. So that would be my sort of general additional caveat to this whole discussion. This is critically important. This is, in my view, maybe the number one thing that the country can do to address poverty in the long run, and one of the most important things we should have a conversation about. But it's not free, and we need to understand the implications of that side of things as well.
And I think your comments are well taken, but I also just want to sort of, stress this idea that we actually have addressed, not all, but many of the penalties, right, facing upper income Americans. And so I think there's a certain kind of both an irony and an injustice, right?
Sure.
We haven't really devoted as much attention to confronting the same penalties that face, working class, lower income American families more generally. And I agree, we'll have to think about how to pay for any kinds of steps taken to address this. And that's a different conversation, but I think you're right. It's a necessary conversation in terms of how do we address, how do we find new income streams? How do we reform other programs so that we're able to address this issue and make it the case that you don't lose major benefits like healthcare, for instance, just because you're married.
Right, that's right.
Brad, can I just add to what Matt was saying? Because I completely agree, but I think that also, it really emphasizes the importance of looking at these programs together and how can we better design the phase outs and all of that so that they do fit together better. So for example, you wouldn't have to necessarily just double the eligibility for the earned income tax credit because you have the child tax credit. If you looked at how those two interacted and you set up a schedule so that as people got married, they then entered the kind of the child tax credit income thresholds, and then you reformed the child tax credit to take into account that phase out for their earned income tax credit, you could set it up in a way that doesn't cost as much as just doubling everything, and it also phases out more slowly as people become higher income. And you could do the same with SNAP as well. I mean, the SNAP and the EITC are not coordinated at all. So you have different cliffs, and Medicaid is the same way. And then Medicaid as you transfer into CHIP. And it's just like all these programs are not at all connected. And that creates, I think, not only confusion among everybody, but just creates these very strange incentives at different points in the income distribution and based on marriage decisions.
Right, and your example of SNAP and EITC is an interesting one because in my head, I think of like, you get SNAP when you're very low income, you start working, your benefits decrease, your EITC increases, but then you're caught in that trap of, I'm losing this monthly benefit that is my food budget, and I'm moving into this annual benefit that you tell me is going to be better, but it's not going to come until, spring of next year. And so it's not just coordinating the research, but it's like coordinating benefit delivery is sort of at the heart of this too.
And I think there's also a very important point again about kind of communication here. And I think, I have difficulty understanding all the different nuances associated with these different programs and policies, because there are obviously a lot of nuances. And so I think plenty of other ordinary Americans will also have, challenges understanding how, things net out. And so as we kind of think about reforms too, I think it's important to figure out, are we working towards a system that basically we can clearly communicate to folks that, look, if you are going to get married, when you're having kids, as you net things out, in most cases, if your income is between, whatever, $10,000 and $60,000, you're not going to pay a big penalty. So we have to sort of couple, I think, any policy reforms here with also a clear communication strategy that allows people to sort of see, how this affects them as an ordinary couple, an ordinary family.
And that sort of takes the notion that we're going to continue to have a lot of out of wedlock childbirths, because right, you also eliminate almost all these marriage penalties if the programs were designed with this. If you have your babies after you get married, you rarely face a penalty that you observe. It's like, well, yes, if I split up, I would get more money, but that's a little different than when I marry, I lose money.
Right. So another question, looking at other questions we've gotten in here for our group today, and let's see here. I guess one question too is sort of how much autonomy do states have to address this issue? I mean, obviously some programs are just kind of driven entirely by what's happening in DC by federal policymakers, but where can states do the most to address this issue from your perspective, Angela or Elaine?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. I mean, obviously TANF, because it's a block grant, gives states a lot of flexibility in what they can do with that money. And so there are a lot of options for states to come up with creative ideas to address marriage penalties. I did see a question in the chat box about why haven't they done more? And I mean, that's a good question. States generally took a lot of that money to do marriage promotion programs or things like really more programming around marriage than things like doing a higher EITC for married families or whatever it is. So they haven't done a whole lot of the things we are talking about, but they certainly could in TANF. Childcare assistance also is a block grant. There's there's less flexibility in TANF and childcare, but states still have flexibility in setting childcare subsidy rates, and I'm sure it could get creative also thinking about how to phase out those income levels. But beyond that, and states can do their own state EITC, but beyond that, I mean, these are federal programs. States have no flexibility in SNAP. They have no flexibility in the federal EITC. So beyond those couple of programs, states don't have a lot that they can do to address these issues, other than the communication, like you talked about, Brad.
Right.
And then when states do sort of take that, they could, like you said, change their EITCs, but then, there's this larger discussion going on with what states are interested in. And so in my view, states are really interested in these sort of left behind workers without children living at home. And so that's where, they're sort of thinking about the EITC. And, the bottom line is, if I increase the EITC for workers without children at home, I am really going to increase marriage penalties. Like, they will be big then. And because now I'll be losing my big childless EITC when I get married, and my partner will be losing his with child EITC. So that's a problem. And the states also have this big incentive not to decouple even when they can, because they rely on the federal government and the tax system for all this administrative workload that states can just skate on the feds. And the more they pull their programs apart, the harder that issue is. So it's a heavy lift to think about states solving this on their own in these federal programs.
Another question that has come in is, would a UBI help to reduce marriage penalties? Anyone want to jump in, Angela or Elaine, or both of you? I'll respond to that idea.
Yeah,
everyone else faints about the idea of a UBI. I'm like, just, that would simplify everything a lot. It's gonna be a big transition and it's gonna cost a lot of money, but it would eliminate a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I do chuckle when I see that question, but it's true. A UBI, I mean, it depends. So if you have a UBI that replaces the welfare state, you would eliminate all the marriage penalties, right? But then you're eliminating the welfare state. So if you are still going to target low-income families with additional support, then you're back to having marriage penalties. So, and I think we all know a lot of the broader issues with a UBI in terms of work disincentives and things like that would then, so you'd create more problem or different problems, I should say, with a UBI, even though it might eliminate the marriage penalties.
Okay. I think you've addressed many of the, I mean, there's a question too about disability payments, and obviously, you know, these issues also apply to many families who are receiving some kind of disability payment as well. So that's, I think, one other area where there's regular payments and there are clear disincentives to marriage. You want to jump in on that, Angela, too, as well? Or?
Well, I was just going to say, I did see that question come through. I mean, SSI, which is disability assistance for low-income people that don't have the work history to get Social Security disability, it might affect them because there is an income criteria, but like SSDI, Social Security disability, wouldn't really have these same marriage penalties because, again, it's based on your work tenure and having a disability. So it's less of an issue in that program, but certainly, and then to the point, so disabled people would be receiving benefits from these other programs that we are talking about, certainly SNAP. And so you would face a SNAP marriage penalty if you're disabled, even if you don't face a penalty with your disability.
And then I think that's where the Medicaid issue comes
And Medicaid.
big. That's a community that definitely doesn't want to lose their health insurance. It might be, paying for just basic supports to keep you going every month. So that's a big consideration.
Great. Well, I appreciate our conversation today, and grateful to everyone who's been involved with this conversation. And I encourage you to take a look at this new research brief that's now on the AI website on marriage penalties. And thank you for taking time, Matt and Angela and Elaine, to be with us on this important topic. So with that, we will sign off, and we thank you again for joining us today at EI.
Thank you.
Thanks all.